Hi, infomercial here. This is just a heads up that I am going to be spoiling pretty much everything from Shadow of the Erdtree. We're talking locations, a look at the full map, items, spells, bosses, things like that. So if you are trying to avoid spoilers, maybe go finish your playthrough of the DLC before you start this review. Shadow of the Erdtree, the long-awaited expansion to Elden Ring, is difficult to review. All the Souls games are, by nature, personal experiences. No two players will come away with the exact same impression even after fighting the same bosses, using the same weapons, and following the same quests. These games, the Dark Souls series, Bloodborne, and now Elden Ring, are a little like an abstract painting. Put two people in a room with it and ask them what it means, and you'll get two very different answers. So, how do you even go about reviewing something like this? I want to share with you my impression of Shadow of the Erdtree, but I want to stress that this is my impression. It won't necessarily be yours, and that's a good thing. I'm less interested in telling you whether I thought the game was good or not, whatever that means, or assigning a number grade at the end to tell you if you should spend your hard-earned money on it, than I am in telling you why the game affected me the way it did. You should buy it. I'll just say that at the beginning. If you liked Elden Ring and other Souls games, you'll like this DLC. It is well worth your time and money, and if you haven't played it yet, feel free to pause this review and go play it for yourself. Instead of a simple good or bad review, I want to talk about the design of this game and the ways in which it left an impression on me, positive, negative, or somewhere in between. Because the truth is, Shadow of the Erdtree is a work of art deserving of thoughtful critique beyond merely slapping a number on it and calling it a day. Critique is not oppositional to art or being mean or petty. It's taking the things we love seriously enough to think critically about them and assess them in the best way that we can. I'm going to do this by talking about 4 different categories: story, world design, performance, and bosses and combat. The chapters are tagged below in the description. As always, thank you for watching. If you like this sort of longer form content, be sure to let me know in the comments. I like fantasy, but being a fan of fantasy can be frustrating. On the one hand, the genre has a rich tradition of evocative storytelling, compelling characters, and vivid world building, but the giants of this tradition loom so large over the contemporary landscape that a lot of modern output feels at best like a pale imitation of the greats, and at worst, nothing more than a compilation of tropes, hastily thrown together to cash in on the latest book talk trend, written with such poor prose it may as well be AI generated. Bookshelves and bestseller lists are stuffed to the gills with low-effort works designed to catch the attention of an algorithm rather than capture the heart and soul of a reader. So, when a work of fantasy does truly separate itself from the cut-and-paste style of modern publishing trends, it feels like a breath of fresh air. Elden Ring did this to great effect in 2022 when it released, and Shadow of the Erdtree further cements this story as a particularly powerful one in the landscape of modern fantasy storytelling. Part of this distinction comes from Elden Ring's refusal to engage with familiar and common fantasy tropes, or when it does engage with them, to do so in a way that casts these familiar themes and character archetypes in a unique light. This is not fantasy by way of Tolkien or Lewis. Rather, Shadow of the Erdtree draws from an altogether stranger stream of 20th century fiction. The DNA here, the mood and settings From Software draws from, are more in the vein of Michael Moorcock, Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, and Clark Ashton Smith and Tanith Lee's fantasy short stories. It is an epic, concerned with themes of ambition, divinity, heritage, war, and destiny, but it never comes at these themes from the angles you would expect, or offers neat and tidy answers to the many questions it poses. The delivery of this story is the same as in other Souls titles. You learn about the characters and setting through exploration and item descriptions, with a few cutscenes here and there where bosses get their big villain monologue opportunities. There is certainly more exposition in the DLC than in the base game, with item descriptions sometimes running multiple paragraphs long and NPC dialogue options like "ask about the nature of the world," which prompts characters to tell you exactly what they think about that in fairly explicit detail. Working with a smaller scale conflict and a shorter cast of characters helps deal with some of the bloat of the base game, with its dozens of major story arcs and hundreds of locations and item descriptions to piece together. The story here is more legible and linear than in any previous game, and I think it's a definite improvement as far as design choices go. There is a place for ambiguity, and you'll find plenty of it in the Land of Shadow, but this is the DLC we've been waiting 2+ years for. We wanted answers, and for the most part, we get those answers, delivered in a way that doesn't feel like it's coloring outside the lines. In fact, there is one revelation that I won't spoil here that hit with the impact of a freight train using only 2 item descriptions, 1 location, and a single musical cue. These games don't always have to beat around the bush about their characters and story. Sometimes the direct, explicit approach is the best. As always, the voice acting is sublime and features what may be my favorite performance in any From Software game ever in the character of Egon. Egon is...
Oh, terror incarnate!
Egon is...
There is life in me yet!
Egon is a... You get the picture. In a game full of pensive, measured, subdued performances, it's nice to see the developers tell someone to just go nuts in the booth and give their best Captain Ahab impression. It's a risk, but one that pays off to great effect. Shadow of the Erdtree not only maintains the base game's streak of moral ambiguity, but turns it up a few more notches. It is a story about power, how it is won, how it is maintained, and the violence inherent of both of these actions. It is a mature work, not because of the blood and guts and general grim nature of the world, but because it is content to leave the player in suspense about whether any of this can truly be resolved. Is there a good ending? What would that even look like in a world like this? Both the resistance to and the adherence to the status quo piles up bodies left and right, with innocents being caught in the crossfire, no matter your decisions as a player. This type of no-win scenario might feel despairing to some, but to me it feels honest. Live long enough and you see your fair share of no-win scenarios, of systems of power and control where no matter what you do, somebody suffers. It's not comforting, but it feels true. We live in a world where too often might does make right, and the calculus by which people make decisions is more often than not self-interested motivation, rather than high-minded ideals or saintly altruism. A story like Elden Ring's merely holds up a mirror to our own world and lets us see our own struggles reflected back to us. And I'll take a story like that any day over a simple power fantasy or a moral lesson about good versus evil. I remember distinctly the first time I found Ash Lake in Dark Souls 1. It's a hidden area at the bottom of a second hidden area that you can only find by traversing the swamp at the bottom of Blighttown, rolling through a hidden wall, and climbing all the way down the Great Hollow, while dodging curse-spewing basilisks and tightrope walking along razor-thin branches. At the bottom of all this platforming and combat is not a huge mass of souls, or the best armor set in the game, or even a particularly good weapon. Your reward is a view and a feeling. The view is easy to describe. The feeling, not so much. A thin peninsula of ash-colored sand stretches out between the pale shores of a lake that seems to go on forever. The skybox on the horizon populated by the trunks of great trees that reach up into the sky above, disappearing into the mist. A few of these trees sit, broken and reachable on foot, along the beach. There is a bonfire nearby, a hydra stalking the shallow waters of the opposite shore, and a giant skull in the middle of the beach. The mood of the place I can only describe as holy, in the old-school religious sense of the term, meaning a place or a thing that is set apart or distinct. This area, with its massive scale and mythological resonance, made me feel small and alone, standing before something that I maybe could never fully understand, and maybe even something that I wasn't supposed to be setting eyes on in the first place. Shadow of the Erdtree has not 1, not 2, not 3 or 4, but at least 5 locations that gave me this exact same experience. Over and over, From Software serves up vistas, locations, and hidden depths to their world that quite literally took my breath away and left me standing very still, staring at my TV, thinking, I didn't know video games could do that. The physical space and world design of Shadow of the Erdtree represents an improvement over the base game so vast that the base game locations now feel primitive and one-dimensional in comparison. Where the base game had breadth and wide-open spaces, the DLC has depth and complexity. It sacrifices sheer square mileage in favor of an interlocking map that adds a new dimension of verticality that was not present before. In the base game, getting to a location was often just a question of pointing torrent in that direction and pressing forward on the analog stick. In the DLC, if you want to go north, you've got to go south first, then east, then through a cave, then end up clear on the other side of the map before finding a winding cliffside path that eventually takes you to your intended destination. It is head-spinning in all the best ways, and an even further improvement on From Software's open world design that already felt like a revelation when the base game was released in 2022. Miyazaki said in interviews leading up to the release of the DLC that the map was roughly the size of Limgrave from the base game, and I think we can now confidently say that he is a liar. By my estimation, the DLC is anywhere from 50 to 75% as large in terms of sheer square footage as the base game, and laid out in such a way that I'm still not sure I've seen everything there is to see. Map pieces are few and far between, leading me to multiple instances where I was deep into an area with no map whatsoever and no idea of where to find it, which only increased the apparent size of the world. At this point, it's getting almost tiring, praising From Software's world design and art direction. They are not only head and shoulders above their peers in the industry, they are operating on a level where they don't have peers. Some of the digital spaces they present in Shadow of the Erdtree feel less like a video game and more like an interactive art exhibit. With little combat or interactivity to speak of, the point is to simply let the environment wash over you. Some of the vistas and viewpoints genuinely gave me a feeling of vertigo with their sheer size and overwhelming nature. When it comes to creating a world to physically move around in and explore, From Software has no equals at this point. I try to avoid hyperbole, but I don't see how I can avoid a statement like that at this point. The DLC hits you over the head with jaw-dropping visual after jaw-dropping visual, with seemingly no end in sight to the well of artistic vision the developers are drawing from. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem From Software shares the same expertise in technical design and optimization that they do in art direction. Throughout my time in the DLC, I experienced one recurring performance issue so severe it rendered the entire game completely unplayable and seriously colored my first impression of this massive and impressive achievement. The issue came in the form of a persistent frame rate stutter that you can see in the footage here. This stutter could only be resolved if I restarted my PS5. Simply reloading an area, dying or quitting and restarting the game was not enough. In fact, if I quit the game, the stutter would persist in the main menu of my PS5 until I restarted the console. This stutter showed up in invasions and online play, in solo offline play, in the open world, in dungeons, and in boss fights, including one particularly infuriating instance where a certain boss only had a sliver of HP left and the stutter caused me to lose the fight when I'm sure I would have won otherwise. There was no telling when this stutter would start, and I couldn't tell you what triggered it either. Sometimes it would start during an effect-heavy attack where the screen was filled with lights and moving objects and NPCs, putting a lot of strain on my console's processing power. But other times, the stutter would start when I was standing completely still, in an empty room. Sometimes I could play the DLC for hours and not see the stutter. Sometimes it would begin as soon as I loaded into an area. This stutter not only occurred inside the DLC exclusive areas, but followed me into the base game as well, rendering the entirety of Elden Ring susceptible to a new game-breaking performance issue that did not exist before I downloaded the DLC. At the time of writing this review, it has not been fixed with a patch. I've spoken with other players who experienced the same issue, so I know it's not a problem with my console, although it did seem to be contained to PC and PS5, with Xbox players not reporting a similar issue. I don't think it's too harsh to say that releasing a game in this state is inexcusable for a team with From Software's resources and prestige. The DLC, while beautiful and impressive on a world design level, uses the same engine and many of the same assets as the base game. There's no reason it shouldn't run at the same consistent 60 FPS that the base game ran for me on PS5 before the launch of the DLC. I don't assign number grades, for the reviews that I do, but if I did, a performance issue like this is enough to take a game from a 10 out of 10 to a 9 or even an 8, depending on how frustrated I am at the time of writing the review. What do we mean when we talk about difficulty as it relates to a boss battle in a video game? Do we mean the encounter is too aggressive, the boss moves too fast, it has too much health, it does too much damage, it's too complicated to understand? Do we mean it feels like you don't do enough damage or you can't wrap your head around certain mechanics? Every time From Software releases a new title, we get a discussion about difficulty. I've seen it happen with Sekiro, Elden Ring, Armored Core 6, and now Shadow of the Erdtree. These discussions typically follow the same back and forth on social media. Someone will claim a boss battle or a section of the game is too difficult, without typically elaborating what they mean by that. Others will respond, either agreeing with them or maybe thinking that they agree when they and the original poster really have two different definitions of the word difficult, or disagreeing. The disagreements usually come in one of two flavors. Either someone saying, get good, i.e., practice more, put more time in, you'll get it eventually, and it's not actually as hard as you feel it is. Or someone saying that the original poster is fighting the boss in the wrong way. It's not that hard, you're just doing it wrong. If you did it like me, if you used the proper tools available in the game, it would be easier. This conversation goes nowhere, as evidenced by the fact that we've had it over and over again for the past 15 or so years of Souls games. So I'm not going to talk about boss difficulty in this section. Instead, I want to talk about boss and combat design, and how Shadow of the Erdtree either succeeds or fails in creating encounters that I personally found rewarding or compelling. And I have to emphasize here the personal aspect of these critiques. These games are, by design, individual and subjective experiences, and no two people will have the same takeaway from a combat encounter. So what is a boss battle? What is the gameplay and narrative point of these encounters? It has everything to do with tension. The building and releasing of tension and suspense is a key aspect of storytelling in any medium. And since Shadow of the Erdtree's story is primarily delivered through gameplay and exploration, From Software uses those elements to build tension. Everything about their level design serves this purpose. The first time you go through an area, you don't know where the enemies, items, or checkpoints are. Every step you take forward is a risk, with new things to discover and fight around every corner. Boss battles serve as a release valve for that tension. You overcome the challenge and you can feel yourself relaxing, maybe for the first time in hours. Now you can see what's behind that locked door, you can progress through a new area, you can move the story forward with more combat and more exploration. You've resolved the suspense and begin the cycle again. It stands to reason then that the more challenging a boss battle is, the greater your satisfaction and relief at the end of it is going to be. From Software president Hidetaka Miyazaki is on record saying this is why they do not compromise on the challenge of these games, because they would be less satisfying if they were easier. However, if you make a boss battle too difficult, it breaks that cycle of building and releasing tension. There is only mounting tension and mounting frustration if a player simply cannot overcome a boss encounter. So, the developers have to walk a tightrope. Not too easy, not too difficult, but an appropriate challenge. Which, again, is incredibly difficult since everyone's definition of an appropriate challenge is different. In previous Souls titles, the player had a number of ways to level the playing field when it came to a boss fight that was repeatedly grinding them into the dust. They could upgrade their weapon to do more damage, or switch weapons to one that a boss was weak to. They could explore and level up their character to come back later, or even find that the boss was optional instead of a required encounter, and they could get help in the form of online co-op as well. Summoning a co-op partner would increase the boss's damage mitigation and health, but you wouldn't be fighting alone anymore. Elden Ring added a new support system in the form of Spirit Ashes, reusable NPC summons you could find, upgrade, and deploy in certain parts of the open world, dungeons, and crucially in most boss battles. You could turn pretty much any fight into a 2v1 at the press of a button, no internet connection or co-op required. But this added a new wrinkle to the problem of boss design. Now, they not only had to balance bosses around different playstyles and make sure that no matter what build a player decided on, they could have a fighting chance, they also had to design bosses that would give that same sense of achievement whether the player was using Spirit Ashes or not. Their track record in achieving this goal in the base game was spotty at best, and I'm afraid that track record extends to Shadow of the Erdtree as well. To mitigate the advantage you get from Spirit Ashes and give the player the same sense of accomplishment and release of tension, Elden Ring's bosses are fast, aggressive, they hit hard, and they're capable of mixing up their attacks to avoid predictability. Many of them punish you for keeping your distance, unleashing devastating attacks when you are at long range, but being relatively less deadly if you are up close and personal. These are all fine choices for boss encounters designed around group play, but can leave players who attempt the bosses solo feeling like they're being punished for their preferred playstyle. It's as if the devs are saying, well, we gave you co-op, we gave you Spirit Ashes, it's your fault for not using them. But that clashes with the ethos of Elden Ring, player choice and freedom. It's a refrain the developers come back to time and time again in interviews. They wanted Elden Ring to feel more open-ended and give the player more agency than any of the previous Souls games. So why is it that boss battles now feel like mandatory co-op sessions? It's important to note, however, that the rest of the world outside the boss arenas does not feel like this. Every challenge, aside from bosses, felt completely surmountable with just a big sword and my own wits and determination. I never felt the need to call for help when I was exploring the open world, stomping through dungeons, or navigating the many towns and villages that populate the Land of Shadow. But as soon as I cross that golden wall of fog, it feels almost like I'm playing a different and worse game. Several specific problems I had with the base game made their way into the DLC as well. Why is it that bosses punish me for being far away, but are also equipped with the speed and agility to create distance as soon as I get close? Why does it feel like I spend half the time running around chasing a boss who's doing acrobatic flips and spins across an arena the size of a football field just to get one hit in and watch him do it all over again? Why does it seem the devs traded attack and movement intelligibility for elaborate visual design? At the end of the day, I don't blame From Software for the current state of boss battles in Elden Ring. I think they gave themselves a problem they're still trying to work out how to fix. Namely, that the introduction of Spirit Ashes had the potential to trivialize every boss battle, so to preserve the feeling of overcoming challenges, they had to change their approach to boss design. It just so happens that the changes they made feel unsatisfactory to me. Gone is the intricate back-and-forth dance and deliberate combat that I used to love, replaced with hit square, summon mimic tier, do jump attack, stagger boss, crit, rinse, repeat. I'm disappointed that From Software seemed to double down on their boss design philosophy, flaws and all, without changing much from the base game, but I also think it's indicative of my feelings on the DLC as a whole. It's more Elden Ring, for better and for worse. If Shadow of the Erdtree is a statement of intent by From Software, a kind of glimpse at the sort of games they want to make in the future, then that means there are things I'm very excited to see them pursue and things that give me pause. Their world design and art direction continues to outpace the competition by such a great distance that it's hard to even call it a competition anymore. But their reach exceeds their grasp when it comes to technical performance and quality assurance. Their combat encounters are hit and miss. When it's good, it's better than anything else out there. But when it's bad, it becomes a confusing slog that feels like it punishes build diversity and customization. And they still, unfortunately, have not solved the problem they gave themselves with the inclusion of Spirit Ashes. Whatever From Software releases next, whether it's another Armored Core game, a new Souls-like, or something completely unexpected, I will buy it and I will play it. They have earned my trust in a way that few other developers have. However, I don't think this trust is a blank check, and their games are certainly not above criticism. The Souls series feels like it's struggling through adolescence right now. It has gone from a cult classic series beloved by a small but dedicated audience to a worldwide phenomenon that outsells franchises like Call of Duty and Madden. With this new success and acclaim comes problems that I don't think From Software has quite figured out yet. Like many of the characters in Elden Ring, I think From Software benefits from and suffers from the double-edged sword of ambition. They are not content to rest on their laurels and phone in a half-assed effort, and they seem intent on continuing to reach for greater and greater heights. This is a blessing and a curse, because ambition can blind people to problem areas and favor progress over refinement. But at the end of the day, I'd rather see a flawed, ambitious project than a stagnant one. These growing pains are hopefully the sign of something even greater on the horizon, and I can't wait to see what it is.